Tonight we're still in Luke, as you may have expected, since we've been in Luke for quite a while at this point. Luke 18, 1 through 14 is our text for tonight. Mainly, we're going to be looking at the second half of that, 9 through 14, not even half, the second portion of Luke chapter 18. Some familiar questions and some familiar subject to some of our other lessons that we've seen lately, or at least in the last several weeks. How's your prayer life? It feels like I've asked this question many times already, but are you persistent in your prayer life? Do you give up if the answer doesn't come immediately? What about the content of your prayers? What do you pray about? What are the things that are usually on your mind? Etc., etc. These are all questions that we'll deal with here tonight because we're going to be looking at two parables. Both of them are about prayer, just with a little bit different focus. In fact, the second one, I guess, is a parable about prayer, but the application isn't really about prayer. There's prayer in the parable, but it's not the point of the parable is not anything to do with prayer. Unlike the first one, the first parable in Luke 18 is definitely about prayer, and an unusual thing about this one is that Luke goes ahead and he tells us beforehand exactly the purpose that Jesus had for telling this parable. So, straight out of the gate, he says in Luke 18, verse 1, "And he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart." So, before you even begin the parable, you already know why the parable is being told and what Jesus was intending by telling this parable. He was intending to show them that they ought always to pray, is what the ESV says. Old ASV also says that. King James says that. And faint not is what the old versions say, or not to faint, which, as the ESV sort of explains for us, not to lose heart. Isn't it easy to lose heart when you pray, or as you pray? Not literally in the middle of your prayer, but you pray maybe regularly, periodically at least, daily, I guess ideally. It could be easy to lose heart. Some of the versions say not be discouraged. So pray always, not get discouraged, not be discouraged. Why do you think Jesus anticipated that they might have a tendency to get discouraged in their prayer?
Because we like to get everything just like that and don't want to wait.
Okay. And he knew that, didn't he? He knows man. He knows the heart of man in general. He also knew of some specific temptations and persecutions that were going to be coming up in the near future around his arrest and crucifixion and the establishment of the church, the kingdom. So this was a very appropriate time to talk about, or to tell them, give them a teaching that would encourage them to not be discouraged and lose heart in their prayer. Because they were going to experience some things, the things he's already told them about. Remember when he told them, you're going to be dragged before councils and governors, and they're going to beat you, and they're going to mistreat you, and some of you will be put to death. So when you think about Christians who are going to witness their brothers and sisters maybe get put to death or thrown in prison and other things like that, it could be easy to lose heart and get discouraged in your prayer and give up on prayer. So Jesus tells this parable, Luke says, to the effect that they ought always to pray. That is, don't stop praying and don't be discouraged in that prayer life. So the parable is this, and it's a simple parable. It's a very well-known parable. verses 2 through 8. It says, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, 'Give me justice against my adversary.' For a while he refused. But afterward he said to himself, 'Though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming.' And the Lord said, 'Hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God give justice to His elect, who cry to Him day and night? Will He delay long over them? I tell you, He will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on earth?'" So, the parable, again, the parable itself is not difficult. The difficulty may come in understanding how this can relate to God. And it's similar to another parable we've seen recently where the character that is supposed to not really represent God but reflect some truth about God seemed a strange choice because He's nothing like God. And God's not like that. But that is the actual point of the man being this way. So in this case, we have a judge. And how is this judge characterized? Not a great guy. Not somebody you want to be in a position of power, for sure. He didn't fear God, and that should be number one on anybody's list for, criteria for a person in power. Sadly, that's pretty much nowhere on the list anymore for most people. And he didn't respect man. So at the very least, even if he didn't fear God, you could have some comfort knowing that he at least respects men, at least in a way that you would want him to. But not this judge. He didn't fear God. He didn't respect man. But there was a widow in that city where he was a judge, and she kept coming to him, requesting him to do something for her, give justice. What was going on, Jesus doesn't say, totally irrelevant. The point is, she was coming to him, denied. Okay? Next day, here she is. Denied. Next day. Every single day. And he kept refusing. But finally, he got to the point where he said, if I don't give her what she wants, she's never going to shut up and leave me alone. She's going to beat me down by her constant appearing before me to ask me to do this. So he did it, is the implication. Jesus doesn't go ahead and say, so he gave her justice, but the implication is that he did. Now, that's the whole parable. How could this possibly be a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart? Well, because Luke then goes on and says, the Lord said, and by the way, this is the 11th time that Luke calls Jesus the Lord in this way, hear what the unrighteous judge says. Well, what was that? What did the unrighteous judge say?
I'll give her what she wants so she quits bothering me.
Okay. I'm going to give her what she wants, not because I love her, not because I'm a good person, not because I care, but simply because she keeps asking. And she's not going to quit. Well, is that how God is? No, quite the opposite. Jesus makes this point. If the unrighteous judge, if a judge like this, if an unrighteous judge does that, will not even more, how much more will a loving Father do that? Give justice. And not just after a long time necessarily, but speedily, to use the word used here anyway. How much more? It's very similar to like Jesus said, if you being evil, you fathers know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give? The only difference is, in this case, the application is persistence. The reason that this unrighteous judge gave her what she asked is because she kept on asking. And I don't know how far we should take that point. Maybe it's safe to take it so far that even if God doesn't give us something, He might, if we keep asking, even if it wouldn't be best. But, who's to say? We do have an expression, to be careful what you wish for. And I don't know if that applies to prayer, but we do have examples, at least, in the Old Testament and other times when God did give people things that they asked for, even though He knew that they would regret it. But nevertheless, Jesus' point, like we already said, like Luke told us from the beginning, they ought to pray without giving up, without losing heart, without being discouraged. Anything else is just mere speculation about God, but the point is, don't stop praying. If you're not getting what you think you are needing or asking for, don't lose heart. Keep praying. Yes, Dean?
Well, since God created man, He knows what man needs.
Mm-hmm.
But yet we know that He still wants man to pray to Him and ask for those things. He knows that we need Him, but yet He wants us or He requires us to ask Him for those things, even though He knows that we need it. But
Yep.
He still wants us to ask.
He knows what we need. He knows what we want, and He knows what's best. He knows everything. And yet, He wants us to ask. And I think we can relate to that. We understand that because it can be that way sometimes in human-to-human relationships. I know what they want, but I would like it if they just asked directly, if they would ask. Even though I know it can make a difference or have some sort of impact of some kind if they ask. God wants us to ask, even though He already knows. And we can have comfort and peace knowing that He knows and that He hears, and that if we don't get what we're asking for, that doesn't mean that we won't ever. And if we don't ever, we can have peace knowing that must not have been what's best for me. That God must not have wanted that to be. And so if God didn't want it to be, then I don't want it to be. That's where we struggle, is being content with the fact that God, we're just assuming, but God doesn't want me to have that, and therefore I don't want to have that. Usually what we would do is, God doesn't want me to have that, and so, forget God, because I know this is what's best, and I know that I need this, and I want this, and He should give it to me. I can't imagine anything being better than me having this thing, this new job, or this, whatever it may be. But if it's not God's will that I have that thing, then we should not want to have that thing either, even if it feels like we really do need that thing. So maybe what is even more powerful in this parable is this maybe I shouldn't say strange, but sudden statement at the end in verse 8, where He says, "Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on earth?" And if we try to put that with the parable, is He talking about prayer, or, based on Luke saying that, mentioning the concept of losing heart and being discouraged, it may be that He's entertaining the idea that when He comes again, He may not even find any faith at all. If the world is like it was in Noah's day, and Jesus comes back, yeah, He'll find a little bit of faith, wouldn't He? In Noah and his family, but, on a large scale, not a whole lot. Pretty much none on a global scale. 8 people out of however many people were alive at that time. So this verse is quoted pretty often, though, or that part of the verse. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And it's just one of those questions that kind of resonates and sticks with you, because it makes you wonder that very question. When he comes, will he find faith? The question we should ask is, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith at my house or in me? Will he find faith in this room? And the answer might be a little scary. But the good news is we can change it. If the answer is scary, we can change that. So, be persistent. It's not the first teaching we've had from Jesus about that principle. Be persistent. God, it makes a difference. Persistence makes a difference. Almost rhymes. So the next parable also revolves around prayer, but with a different application. Jesus tells us, actually Luke does the same thing again, and he says why he told the parable. He told this parable, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Especially that first part. He told it to some, not because some were trusted in themselves that they were righteous, but he told it to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. Of course, he also told it because of people trusting in themselves that they were righteous, but the word "to" there is pretty significant because he was saying it to them directly. They were there, and there's a pretty good chance that they were Pharisees, which happens to play a crucial role in the parable itself. So, he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Jesus was good at personally tailoring his teaching based on his audience. Here's what he says. He tells us that 2 men went up to the temple to pray. The temple at Jerusalem. God intended the temple to be a house of prayer, as we've read and heard elsewhere. The Jews would generally view the temple that way. If they were too far away from the temple to go there to pray, they would pray towards the temple. So, 2 men went into the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector, a publican, which was a tax collector. Pharisee, publican. Now, if you were a Pharisee in the audience, actually by this time, they would probably already start to suspect something, like, okay, where's this going to go? But more instinctively, they would already have picked out who the good guy and the bad guy was. And it's not a difficult one because everybody hated the publicans. Pretty much everybody. And there was a reason for that. The tax collectors, the office, or whatever you want to call it, the role of tax collector, was one of the most hated among all the Jews. They were Jews. The Romans appointed Jews to collect taxes from the Jews. They were collecting taxes for Rome, but they appointed the Jews to do it, which from their side, I guess, was smart. It didn't help much, though, because the Jews, it was almost even worse to the Jews because then they viewed them as traitors. You're taking money from your own brethren and giving it to the enemy. But anyway, a tax collector, in order to understand anything about what Jesus is about to do with this parable, we have to understand the nature of these tax collectors. Because the taxes were collected by region, the Romans would auction off this office. It was a highly sought position. The highest bidder, I guess, would get it. whoever agreed to collect the highest default or status quo would get the job, something along those lines. And all Rome cared about was the number in their hand matching the number that they had on paper. So if they said every, whatever the period was, let's just call it every day. Every day you will give us, we've agreed to this amount of money. As long as they got that amount of money, they didn't care about anything else. And what that opened up the door for was the tax collector could pocket everything else beyond that number. And since it wasn't policed and the Romans didn't care, they could make up any charges and taxes they wanted to get more money. And you would be amazed at some of the examples of the taxes. You think ours are bad? Well, just imagine if almost everything you did had a tax on it. Walking down the sidewalk tax, and every time you walk past this certain spot, you have to pay a tax. Or if you're carrying something, you got to pay a tax for the fact that you're carrying something too. And and they could just make up something like, okay, you got to let me look in your bags here, and if you got 10 things, well, sorry, but you got to pay the 10 item tax because you got 10 items in here. So I mean, just anything they wanted to make up, they could. And there was no accountability. So you can imagine what kind of people would be attracted to this job. What kind of people you think that would be?
Money seekers.
Money hungry, greedy, selfish, not caring and compassionate people, but those with lesser moral values it would be extremely lucrative for them because they wouldn't have any conscientious problem with it. Hey, I'm just looking out for number one. I mean, I got the job. Sorry. Whenever a position can get you rich for doing pretty much nothing, you're not going to get very good people that are attracted to that. It's kind of one of the problems we're having in our day right now. So, obviously, or naturally really, the Jews would come to hate the tax collectors because they were, as a rule, notoriously corrupt, because the office itself became notoriously corrupt, and publican was pretty much a byword among the Jews. That's why several times we read, hey, this Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners. What a strange pair of people that is. They could have just said sinners, but no, tax collectors and sinners. That just goes to show how hated they were. But once we understand that, and by the way, not all tax collectors were bad. Zacchaeus is one that we know for a fact was not corrupt. We can maybe assume that about Matthew, but we don't know about Matthew before Jesus came into his life. But Zacchaeus was one of the good guys who obviously maybe wanted to take that role out of his compassion and love for people. I'm not going to cheat the people, and that's why I want to have this job. But as a rule, they all took advantage of the people because everything beyond their status quo was right into the pocket. So the more they cheated, the more rich they became. So these are our two characters. One of those guys and a Pharisee. It's like, this isn't even fair. It's obvious who the good guy is. It's the Pharisee. Because I don't even like Pharisees, but if I got to choose between those two, I'm going with the Pharisee, surely. Well, this is all Jesus' point. I mean, he's setting this up. Just like he did with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Three Jews, two of which were two Jews, two of which were both highly placed in the totem pole or whatever. But the Samaritan ended up being the hero. Well, here we have a Pharisee and a tax collector. Verse 11. the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week. I give tithes to all. I give tithes of all that I get. So there's his prayer. There's one prayer. That's prayer number one. The tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. There's the contrast. Okay, Jesus has created this contrast. This tax collector appears to be different than most tax collectors. More like Zacchaeus. And by the way, if you look at Luke 19, verse 7, ironically, Zacchaeus is right. The story about Zacchaeus, right in the very next chapter. You know what they called Zacchaeus? And it wasn't a wee little man. That's not what they called him. That's what we call him, because that's the song that's been drilled into our heads from decades of Vacation Bible School. But they did not call him a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. What did they call him in 19, verse 7? A sinner. Now Zacchaeus was a sinner because he was human, but he wasn't a sinner the way they called him. Here's what's ironic about that. What did this tax collector in Jesus' parable call himself? A sinner. Be merciful to me, a sinner. I'm a sinner. Well, a tax collector being at the temple to pray is already going to be a shocker to the people here in this parable. But the fact that he said this is his prayer, is even more moving. Totally different than the Pharisees' prayer. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. Now we get the idea that this is already an arrogant and elitist, spiritually elitist thing, even though, to be totally fair, even though this is not a real person because Jesus is just telling a parable, somebody could be thankful that they're not like certain other people and not in a prideful and arrogant way. But that's clearly not in line with the parable. This man he thought he was apparently just the greatest thing that God could ever have at his disposal. Like Luke said at the beginning, he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. That's what this Pharisee was doing. I'm so thankful, God, that I'm not like other men. I'm not like extortioners and unjust. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not like this tax collector. Ironically, he was right, wasn't he? He was not like that tax collector. But not in the way that he thought. Maybe should have pointed out, it says the Pharisee was standing by himself. ESV says standing by himself. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. Anybody say anything, read differently than that?
Stood and was praying to himself.
Okay, stood. See the word order. I've talked about word order before, and depending on the language you're dealing with, word order can matter a lot, it can matter a little, or it can matter none. Well, depending on word order, it makes a big difference in this case. So some versions have it that he was standing by himself and prayed. Others say that he was standing and prayed to himself or prayed with himself. And that seems to fit more, in my opinion, just because Jesus then mentions the tax collector stood afar off. So when we think about standing by himself and standing far off, sounds like the same thing, doesn't it? Far off from what? Other people. So that sounds like the same thing, but Jesus seems to be making a contrast. So I don't think he's saying the Pharisee went and stood over by himself, but he stood to pray as opposed to kneeling or some other posture. And he prayed to himself out loud, it seems, or maybe not, I don't know. Prayed silently, maybe he prayed out loud, but it was pretty selfish and self-reflective. He stood up and prayed this prayer that was totally inappropriate. He says, I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get. Well, good for him, right? That is good. Those are good things, aren't they? I guess fasting twice a week, depending on his motives, like Jesus talked about. But giving tithe, he says, I give tithes of all that I get. So that, let's give credit where credit's due. That's good of him. But he sure is proud of himself for it. Doesn't it sound like? A more humble man would not want to, he wouldn't go around broadcasting this. And again, this is assuming that the man was praying out loud. But anyway, he clearly trusted in himself and his own righteousness, the way he viewed righteousness. And he viewed others with contempt. Even, I'm so thankful I'm not like this tax collector. But the tax collector went and stood afar off. He wouldn't even look up. What does it mean, generally speaking? I know none of us are body language experts, but I don't think you have to be one to understand the concept. Maybe somebody who won't look up. They're staring at their feet. Okay, they're ashamed maybe.
Fearful.
What's that?
Fearful.
Okay, fearful, uncomfortable. I guess uncomfortable can cover a whole lot of different things. So that's the picture we get. The shame and the afraid, like fearful, in a maybe intimidated by being in the presence of God. He wouldn't even lift up his eyes to heaven. And he beat his breast. Now, to us, if somebody did that, we would think they were a little crazy. If somebody got up to lead the prayer and stood up there and beat his breast like a gorilla, we would think that was weird. And we wouldn't hear anything they said in that prayer because we'd be thinking, what did he just do? And this is weird. But this would not have been the case there in their culture. And it's a gesture of sorrow, burden. He is overburdened. He is carrying something heavy. And his prayer was short. That's not what makes it good, by the way, but it was short. Just 7 words in English, according to some translations. I guess it might vary between translation, but the ESV is 7 words. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The fact that he called himself a sinner alone already puts him above the Pharisee in his heart and spirituality. Because the Pharisee does the Pharisee give any sign that he may even entertain the idea that he might be a sinner? Sounds the opposite, doesn't it? His whole prayer is saying, I'm glad I'm not a sinner, pretty much. I do everything right. And I never do anything wrong. I either do good things or gooder things. So, who's better here? Well, verse 14 says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. Well, which man was that? The second one he just talked about, or just mentioned. The publican, the tax collector. He went down to his house justified. He went home justified. That's a very important word biblically. It doesn't mean, in this sense, the same like we would use it, like he was justified for doing what he did. But this is a word that is, if you put it in another tense, another form, justification. What's justification, scripturally speaking? What's a synonym? Can you think of a synonym for justification?
Proof? Forgiven?
Nope. Okay. Forgiven, I heard. There's another Asian word that it's often paired with. Sanctification.
Set apart.
So, justification, sanctification, forgiveness or forgiven, salvation, all these words that go hand in hand. Romans 4:25, Jesus was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Romans 5:16, the free gift is not like the result of that one man's sin, for the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brought justification. And then 2 verses later, Romans 5:18, one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life. So, if that's what justification means, what Jesus brought about on the cross, then to be justified in that sense would mean God viewed his prayer, viewed him and his prayer, his spirit, his heart favorably, and he was blessed. He was justified, to use Jesus' word, rather than the other. So one of them was, and one of them wasn't. The one who was the one that they would have thought, no way. The tax collector? You kidding me? How could a tax collector be justified over a Pharisee? What do you think? If you were Jesus and somebody in your audience said, how could a tax collector be justified over a Pharisee? What would your answer be? Humility. Which is a condition of what? The heart. The condition of his heart. Humility. Not maybe selflessness, but self-denial. Not self-elevation like the Pharisee did. Even though the Pharisee did some good things, honorable things, giving tithes of all that he gets, which would be wages, could be gifts, could be anything. He says, all that I get. So, somebody, I was awarded or rewarded with some money for something, I'm going to tithe that too. So he did some good things. But look at his heart. Look at the way he viewed his good deeds. He viewed them as self-sufficient. I am self-sufficient because I do these good things. And in that, he pretty much nullified his good deeds, didn't he? Jesus already talked about how the heart can nullify good deeds. Fasting was a thing that all Jews viewed as a good thing and spiritual thing. But you can make your fasting useless, Jesus said, based on your heart. Praying, great thing. You can make your prayer void and vain by your heart and your motive for doing it. So, this tax collector was justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Pharisee exalted himself. He's going to be humbled. Now, the Pharisee, remember, I pointed out, he told this parable to some who were just like this Pharisee in the parable. They have a choice of how to respond to this. What do I do with this parable? I could get mad because I get the feeling, like we read in another place, they perceived he was talking about them. And they didn't like that. They could have been ashamed. They could have reacted to this parable just like the tax collector in the parable. Not even looking up, beating their breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But instead, we don't read anything about that. But we can assume, based on the way the events continue to pan out, they were not pleased with Jesus' implication. It wasn't even an implication. It's an undeniable fact of God's will that to exalt yourself is going to get you humbled. But if you humble yourself, you'll be exalted. What is it about people that find it so difficult to humble themselves? Isn't that a strange conundrum of humanity? What do you think? What is it about humbling yourself that people hate so much? Or that they don't want to do? They don't view it as something honorable or virtuous.
They don't want to change their ways
Okay, don't want to change.
and give up whatever they have and do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, if I humble myself, part of that is going to eventually involve sacrifice. Because part of humbling yourself is putting other people before yourself and other things along that line. So that means I'm not getting preferential treatment and not getting what I want. I think that's a big part. I want to get what I want. And not everybody, and hardly anybody, in fact, is going to actually think that in their minds, or especially say that I want to get what I want. No adult would have the nerve, most adults would not have the nerve to say that, because they would be embarrassed if they said that. They would realize how childish that is. But their actions say it. My way or the highway, period.
Well, most people confuse humility with weakness.
Okay, some people confuse humility with weakness. If I back down, I'm the weak one.
Pride.
So, yeah, that's a form of pride too. Because, first of all, it doesn't make you the weak one, does it? And second of all, even if it did, who cares? It's still the right thing to do. But if we're prideful,
Not wanting to give up control. I mean,
Okay.
wanting to maintain control, which ironically you don't have in that situation anymore.
Yeah. So, depending on the circumstance, it'll play out in different ways, but control is part of it, even if it's a petty kind of control or not much control really at all, but simply, this is the way I want it to be, and therefore it's the right way. And if what you want is different than what I want, then what you want must not be right. Yes, Dean?
Just like Christ, he's the perfect example of humility. Because when he came down to this earth, he said he came down not to do his will, but the will of the Father. So he showed humility from the very beginning, where that he was giving God the glory and being humble in it. And we know that we are to follow his example. If we fail to be, like I say, if Christ failed to be humble, we would all be lost.
Yep.
That's the same with us. If we fail to be humble in our lives, we're going to be lost.
Yep.
Because it doesn't matter what we do, if we're not humble about it, it doesn't matter. We can give as much money as we can, but if we don't do it with in humility or a right heart, it doesn't matter what we do.
Yeah. We can do, fasting doesn't require any sort of heart, goodness of heart. Anybody can do that. As far as your spirituality is concerned, anybody could tithe. But what about people? The way you deal with people, treat people. Look at the way the Pharisees were known for treating people. Ugly. They were smug. They were cruel in a lot of ways. Inappropriate. They didn't do anything to help anybody be better.
thought they were smarter.
They thought they were smarter, smarter, wiser, better in general, more righteous. And if you weren't as righteous as a Pharisee, then I wouldn't even want you to be in the kingdom with me. That's the way they viewed it. That's the way they thought of it. Jesus was the ultimate example of humility, because if there was anybody who ever had the right or deserved to demand His will, it would have been Jesus. And yet, He did it less than anybody. Ever. And if He had simply exercised His own will, the New Testament would read a lot differently. Even in little things like, show us a sign so we'll believe. Being sarcastic like that, man, I would have been a sucker for that every time if I was Him. Oh, you want to see a sign? I'll show you a sign, and then I'd really show them. And just to get the satisfaction of seeing their faces. And one of those gotcha moments. Jesus never did that. And I bet His disciples sometimes were like, Lord, why'd you let them get away with that? Mocking you like that, scoffing, challenging you, and you didn't answer it? And I can't help but wonder if that is Jesus doing that was one of the things that Judas stumbled over about Jesus. But He showed humility. This Pharisee in the parable was characteristic of the Pharisees in general. He did not go back to his house justified. He felt good. He already felt good before he ever got there. He's feeling good about himself. Why wouldn't he? He's the most righteous of all people who's ever walked the earth. But Jesus says, no, he's not. He may be self-righteous, but there's one thing he's not, is justified before God. This tax collector, though, was, because of the condition of his heart that he showed and communicated in his prayer. It's about humbling yourself, or as opposed to exalting yourself. So what about us? How's our prayer life? Are we persistent? Are we prideful or humble when we pray? What about our heart? Maybe that's the bigger issue here. What is my attitude toward myself? What's your attitude toward yourself? What is your attitude toward others? If we are letting the devil and sin take control of our lives, we need to change our hearts. Let it go. Trust in God. And let His power and His will fill your soul and fill you with joy. His joy.